What is the perfect movie franchise? Does such a thing truly exist? The License to Watch podcast sets out to answer that age-old question. Join comedians Matt McGregor, Harris McCabe, and Colin Shaw as they dissect your favorite film franchises one movie at a time. Along for the ride is a different film industry guest for every episode. Listen as the boys play judge, jury, and executioner and decide which of your favorite movie franchises are worthy of a license to watch.
Hello everyone, Screenplay Archaeology host KiramidHead here. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to get some intro stuff out of the way. First things first, we are now part of the Fandom Limb Media podcast network, so I'm going to link their site down below. And that's why you would have just heard a promo for another podcast, because they're another one of the shows on the network. And as per usual, if you like the show and you'd like to know more, you can check out our social media pages on Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, and even Instagram now. The show also has a Patreon if you're willing to gift money, but you don't really need to if you don't want to. And we also have a Discord server, which you can join if you want to chat with, the group members there. So that link is going to be down below as well. So yeah, sit back, guys, and enjoy the show. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I am your host, KiramidHead, coming at you again with a new solo episode, which I actually haven't done one of these in quite some time. And I'm going to be talking tonight about a loose script adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story titled From Beyond. And this one is kind of a very, very loose reimagining of the original story. In this version, it's about an archaeologist who discovers this strange kind of anomaly of an artifact which points his way to this cave where there's this obelisk, which is theorized to be like marking the interdimensional prison where this being that's implied to be a demon of some sort was locked away eons ago. And he takes a team with him under military supervision because this is in Afghanistan. He takes them in and they have only a certain amount of time in order to examine this thing fully. The idea being that they'll draw this thing out and then catch it and see what it does, what it's like, if it's evil or not. So as anyone knows about the Lovecraft story or the film adaptation from the 1980s that was done by Stuart Gordon, and is one of the more out there kind of stories, adaptations of a Lovecraft story at any rate. It's quite a bit different because the original short story is indeed a short story. Depending on the edition you have or like the way the way the book was printed, among other things, it can be anywhere from 7 to 10 pages long. So it's not very in-depth. The short story is basically a scientist in a house in New England invents this kooky machine that can allow people to look into the dimensions that are all around us, but we normally can't perceive. And then something starts coming out of it. And the friend he brings to the house to sort of witness, the end of the experiment destroys the machine, but the scientist dies. And that's kind of the end of it. Now, when Stuart Gordon did the movie in the 80s, he did this really smart thing with it where he basically adapts the short story as the first roughly 10 minutes of the movie. And then the rest of it is basically a sequel or a continuation that expands on the ideas and does some really crazy, interesting things with it. Some really good effects, which look even better on the Blu-ray, actually, because the DVDs always had some kind of color correction issues on some of the composite shots. And those all look a lot better on the Blu-ray. The Blu-ray transfer really cleaned it up. It's very beautiful looking. I definitely, if you like the movie, I definitely recommend that Scream Factory release because it just makes the movie look a lot better. And so, yeah, it's a short story. It's pretty decent. It's not like Lovecraft's elite best, but it's not like one of his worst either. Like, he has some kind of weak stories here and there, but From Beyond is it's a nice little mid-tier Lovecraft story. It's a cool little idea. And the movie is honestly just a really fun sort of building upon the ideas of it and doing, kooky different things. And whereas Stuart Gordon is probably better known for Reanimator, I actually would be one of the relative few to argue that From Beyond is a somewhat better movie, a more interesting movie. Not that Reanimator is bad, mind you, but From Beyond, I think, just for me works a little bit better. Now, this script is written by Cynthia Kernan and is dated February 14th, 2007, so Valentine's Day, and it's a revised draft. Now, Cynthia Kernan was a frequent collaborator and eventually the wife of Albert Pyun, who's a kind of pretty reasonably well-known B-movie director. He did a bunch of stuff in the 80s and into the 90s that's still kind of fondly remembered by fans of that sort of thing. Like, I quite like Cyborg. I thought Nemesis was pretty decent. Captain America 1990 is terrible, but from what I understand, that wasn't entirely his fault. That was a 21st century studios, I should say. That was Menachem Golan's second company that never had any money for anything, even less than Canon did, so it was kind of whatever. And so, yeah, he's done that. He's done some movies that weren't so good. And so it's like any director, he has kind of a mixed track record, especially when you're working with that kind of budget. But so, and they had done together in 2006 a Cool Air movie, which is another Lovecraft story, which I have not seen. The IMDb score does not fill me with a whole lot of confidence. It's got like a 4.6 or something like that last I looked. So this is almost kind of reads like it's meant to be, just based on the timeline here being written a year after that, like it's meant to be like a companion piece that never got made. And so just starting off from the beginning, so it opens at an archaeological site, which is in the Marco Desert, which according to the script is on the border between Iran and Pakistan. Now, I tried looking this desert up. I couldn't find anything about it, so I don't know if this is just like an obscure name for it that doesn't really get used a whole lot, or if it's something that they fictionalized. And it also says 14 months ago, which from when exactly? Like, that's an odd way to put it. But so we meet archaeologists Jack Winslow, who's American, and Marty de la Vega, who is from Argentina, as Jack discovers a metal object in the sand that's covered with these kind of hard-to-identify carvings. They're not any known kind of language or writing system. And they argue a little, and it's basically expositional arguing where Mary's like, this is why you lost tenure, you don't follow protocol. And you didn't do it with us either, so it's kind of implying that they had like a romantic relationship, which the script takes an absurdly long time to actually explain that to us. It's like, wait a minute, what's going on with these two? It's like, oh, you haven't told me everything. It's like, and he says, yeah, I found similar carvings 2 years prior. And then she gets less angry for the time being, and Jack gets the object loose from the clay, revealing it to be a small statue of multiple interlinked demons. And then Jack tells her this is only the beginning, and when he doesn't say any more, they start arguing again, with Jack dropping the statue. And when it hits the ground, the earth begins to shake, a loud screech is heard, and the two are thrown off balance, but Jack keeps his footing, and he sees a glowing archway and something beyond it that is indistinct to the audience, but that is completely visible to him and is completely horrifying. And just before Mary passes out, she sees that Jack's face no longer appears human, which she sees this, but it doesn't alarm her in any way, and she keeps working with him throughout this whole script. So this intro scene, not great. Like, it's very much cramming in information and just be there to be like an eye-catching opening scene with the whole thing about his face changing. It's not great. And so then it jumps ahead to the present day, so 14 months later, according to that opening, in Afghanistan, where Jack gets off a helicopter to meet with a General Bellows, who mentions that a team has been put together and that getting clearance for them has been difficult, especially because Mari, who's with them, is not a U.S. citizen or isn't U.S. born. Like, that comes up like a couple times, and then I don't know why. Like, it's almost like we're supposed to think that Bellows is some sort of racist villain, and he's not even in this after like a few scenes. And Jack meets with the team in the operations tent, and we get basically what amounts to about 15 pages of exposition here, which is a bit much. And it's Mari, microbiologist Robin Jason, who specializes in prehistoric life, operations tech Sam Matthews. Bellows seems to recognize this guy but can't quite place him. That is a plot thread that goes nowhere once again. And biophysicist Mike Brock, who just for some reason makes me think of Kent Brockman from The Simpsons. And they were all told different stories to get them there, and they want answers. And Robin in particular says this doesn't feel like a normal Department of Defense contract, but rather NSA. Once again, it's kind of vaguely hinting that there's some sort of intelligence side to this mission, stuff that doesn't ever really get explained or brought up again. And Jack explains how 2 years prior, which I'm guessing is the thing he was talking about earlier before he finds what he calls the key guide in the desert at the beginning. He found a metal sarcophagus also in the Marco Desert, covered with carvings in no known language. So I'm guessing this is the original find. And the carvings also depict a being identical to Pazuzu, whom you might know best as that statue from The Exorcist, or as that name they keep saying a million times in Exorcist 2. And it's the first Satan, as he calls him. And it's like, it's like the first idea of a demon or hell or anything like that in human history, and that's not really true. Pazuzu isn't really that in the actual mythology, but there's a lot of stuff like that in this. And then the object that they found at the beginning has pointed the way to an obelisk, which they think connects to a time-space prison with something nasty inside it, and they think this prison was the original inspiration for hell. And they speculate that the obelisk helps form a temporary bridge and allow whatever is inside to infect or possess people. In fact, there was another such obelisk in East Africa, and once it started possessing villagers, the US Army nuked it, something Bellows isn't keen to talk about. And the obelisk they're looking for is the only one left, and they want to examine it to determine if these beings really are dangerous. And I'm like, if it got so bad that you had to nuke the thing, wouldn't they perforce be dangerous? Which is one of those things which isn't clear until later, is the fact that they have like a containment system set up and they're trying to catch this thing. Like let the thing come through and then catch it so they can examine it. That's not very clear until like the halfway point maybe in this script. And so the obelisk gets located in an area occupied by the enemy, like they mentioned both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda at different times. That's not really relevant to anything here, like it comes up maybe once, but that's about it. And they have until tomorrow afternoon when a particular star alignment occurs to get there. And once there, they'll have an hour to attempt to capture of anything that escapes through the portal, any more time, and they can't be kept safe. So yeah, basically the thing is that when this particular star alignment occurs, these obelisks start pulsing or whatever, and that means that whatever is inside this prison that they mark the entrance to can come through. They'll have air support as well as a security team led by Colonel Murphy, who's in on the briefing. And he takes 6 spec op guys with him who they get there and then they just disappear for the entire rest of the script until like right near the end. So yeah, the whole team, they don't even do anything. And so Robin talks to Mary, who's not happy about being brought along for a covert mission. And they speak to each other in Spanish, which is a neat little way to them to sort of covertly speak to each other. And they do that again in a little while, where they're talking privately and they speak in Spanish and then switch over to English. It's an interesting way to use the language. And elsewhere, Bellows and Jack talk, and Jack says he's deliberately hiding what's going to happen if they stay longer than 60 minutes, as it wiped out the East African team. Now, that's another thing. The way these 15 pages of exposition go is that they're just throwing stuff at you and not necessarily in the most coherent order or the most sensible ways. Like, it's kind of hard to piece together everything they're talking about. And my notes is just my best attempt at sort of condensing it down, because it's just, and this, and this, and this. Because they also mentioned that, the idea of, hell and demons didn't enter into the cultural consciousness until 15,000 years ago, right before humanity left East Africa. And that was also the last time the solar alignment occurred. So the implication is that humanity learned of demons in Africa when this happened, and then in response to this, that's why we left Africa and spread out into the rest of the world. Really interesting idea, but there's so much stuff crammed into just these 15 pages of back and forth exposition that it really doesn't have enough room to breathe. Now, I'll admit I mainly picked this script because it was short, because I have a project coming up next, and I needed the time I needed to get another episode in before I start like really, really working on that, just to of course fill the gap in. So I needed something short to work on. I almost wish this script was longer, just because there's so many ideas in here that needed more room to breathe. And so Bella steps out of the tent, and then Mary steps in, unhappy that Jack downplayed the spiritual side of the phenomena they're dealing with, which doesn't make sense in a minute, because she goes on and on about being agnostic in the next scene. But like the connection to good and evil, and Jack insists it's all physics and science, which to the script's credit, later on they do explain some of this stuff through physics and such, and it is actually at least reasonably credible to my untrained ears. And Mary's like, Mari, you should keep morality out of it, so she leaves the tent. And Jack looks at a video feed of the artifact, which swims before his eyes. Jack then screams and clutches his tent, his tent, his chest, as he has a vision of his soul flying through hell and getting swallowed by shadowy forms before Robin and Mari wake him back up in the operations tent. And so then we come to what's actually a really good scene in this script, like really well written, really interesting character development. So Mari and Robin, they talk, they're in another tent, and Robin's bringing up her concerns over the lack of prep and Jack's reputation for doing things like this. And Mari replies that with the conjunction occurring so soon, they needed to move fast in case anything bad happens if they don't. And as far as Jack goes, his obsession, that's what broke them up. But after the Marco Desert find, she finally understood it. How well did she understand it if she didn't look at his face change into a monster and go, nope, out of here? The conversation then moves to whether they believe in possession, with Mari taking an agnostic view while Robin is a devout Catholic. And this is a really good conversation because it's showing like a friendship between these two characters with very different perspectives on life and the universe without being judgmental of each other. And it's just really well written, really well thought out kind of dialogue. Some of it gets a little on the nose, but there's a line Mari has that I think is actually really well written where she says something to the effect of, as the agnostic, I'd like to think that when I look the devil in the face, I'd know exactly what to say. And then Robin goes, well, yeah, it would be the Lord's Prayer or Psalm 23, because of course those are the things that a non-religious person would know in terms of prayer. So that comes up later. And so Colonel Murphy, who makes Robin blush by calling her ma'am, which is a setup for a romantic thing that doesn't actually go anywhere, tells them it's time to leave, and the team piles onto a helicopter, which forms part of a convoy. On the way there, one of the helicopters gets shot down by the enemy, and that's the last time we hear about them. And Robin wants them to turn around immediately. However, since the equipment is all still intact, they're under orders to continue until the mission is compromised or completed. They soon land in a dry lake bed, and Jack leads the team through the nearby crags to the cave entrance at such a pace that they're all exhausted thanks to the gear they're carrying, and they all kind of help each other out. Like Mari helps Mike, and then Murphy helps Robin, which is building that thing again. And they all file, and the six guys, the six spec op guys all just stay outside the cave, and we never hear from them until very much later. They all file into the obelisk chamber where the artifact has been completely surrounded by a containment unit, and soon a pulse is felt in the air, signaling that the gate is beginning to open. With their equipment hooked up to the unit, they have a camera view of the artifact, which soon begins to swim and the demon carvings begin to move, and it begins to give off an aura, which soon starts to form a demonic face. And they begin blasting it with electrical impulses and shooting plasma at it in an attempt to capture it, but it seems too strong, and Mari wants to just shoo it off with the extra plasma. And Jack argues, no, we need to let it through so we can capture it, so we got a bit of Ghostbusters here. Also, a general kind of Prince of Darkness vibe to the whole thing as well. But Murphy overrules him, and the containment unit is flooded with plasma until the power blinks off and then comes back on. And everything is back to normal, but it turns out the safeties didn't kick in like they were supposed to. And Mari discovers that the computer coding has been slightly tampered with, and of course suspects Jack, who in an enraged outburst calls her a stupid bitch. And then there's a debate that ensues, with the team insisting they saw an actual demon, with Jack trying to rationalize things. And Murphy then reminds them that they only have 27 minutes left before they have to evacuate, so we're moving pretty quickly here. And so am I. Damn, this episode's going to be short. And the team exits the cave for a rest before trying again, and Mike has a chat with Robin about Jack's history. And he got his crazy dimension theory published in a journal, but it was so crazy that Stanford gave him the boot, on top of the fact that he was banging his teaching assistants and students, so random fact to be throwing in about this character. So he's acting weird because he's kind of possessed, but he's also kind of an asshole anyways, so does it really matter? I don't know, it feels kind of late to be throwing that information in there. And then Mari talks with Murphy right as he is about to report back via radio. She tells him to relate everything that he saw and that she's recommending the mission be shut down. Back in the cave, Jack has another dream vision about his soul floating through hell, this time catching on fire before the shadows tear him apart. These dream sequences are actually really interesting, at least. There's only 2 of them, but they're actually kind of interesting and show why he's so driven. Jack wakes up just as the rest of the team is setting up again, and he pulls Mari to the side. He apologizes for everything, but tries to justify himself by saying there's a price to pay for being on the cutting edge. So the usual, we gotta do what we have to do, blah, blah, blah. Mari fires back, saying that he was always passionate, but finding that thing in the desert has changed him somehow into a very different person. We don't have a good enough idea of what he was like before that, so kind of rings a little false. And he then retorts that she's just heard over the fact that he never loved her, which he discounts as unfair. However, after he walks away, Mari admits to herself that she was indeed hurt by that, and it's like, okay, now you tell us what the nature of their relationship was. Thank you. Mari talks with Robin about Jack and how something needs to be done, but they're interrupted by Mike, who is running a systems check and discovered something. The particles inside the containment unit act like a viral pathogen, which is basically how possession is explained to work. There's these other particles that hold them in place until they can fully transfer to a new host. And even more concerning is that something seems to have breached, which has Murphy ready to call in the nuke. They see Sam has left the room while they've been talking, and they run off to find him in the cave. I actually find that really interesting, like trying to come up with like a particle physics explanation for what possession is. It's something that exists on like the particle level, the subatomic level, that meshes with your particles and kind of takes you over. That's a really interesting pseudoscience-y explanation. So there are a fair amount of good things in here. They find Sam and he seems perfectly normal, but they decide to run a cellular examination on him anyways. And then Mari finds Jack in another part of the cave looking sickly and pale, his eyes out of focus. She tells him what's been going on and he heads off. Mari, however, hangs back, snatching a bloody tissue off the floor that Jack left behind. And while the rest of the team is running the tests on Sam, Mari examines the blood sample from Jack under a microscope, finding a black spot among the cells that she can't get any detail on no matter the magnification. And the computer analyzes the anomaly, but can't figure out what substance it's made up from, which it should be able to figure out anything like that. So really, once again, really intriguing scene the way it's set up. And the tests on Sam wrap up, and he turns out to be perfectly fine. Another debate ensues about whether to continue on with the experiment, as Jack wants to do, or get out of there. Mari once again argues that they should leave, even if they still have 6 minutes left in which to work, and this is kind of... It's a little repetitive from the scene before, like you could have done something a little bit different here to kind of change it up a bit. Jack is unhappy about this and stalks off, his face changing into something inhuman when it's turned away from the team. Not described at all, just says inhuman. Mari says they should grab their data and take off, which Colonel Murphy agrees to, radioing in for extraction in about 10 minutes. Mari shows the black spot in the blood sample to Robin on her laptop screen, and after cycling through a series of things it could possibly be and potential reasons why the computer couldn't identify it, Mari theorizes that it's a stray particle that came through and got embedded into Jack's system at some point. As the two of them try to shut down the machines, the black spot starts to take over the blood sample and spread beyond the microscope, unseen by them. Pretty cool visual idea. And when they keep getting locked out and are unable to shut down, they say they hope that Sam has better luck. And so we go to Sam, who is working at his laptop when the screen goes black, and green words appear on it. Yo, I have come. Not exactly up to par with the words on the computer screen and something like I mentioned before, Prince of Darkness, kind of silly. A shadowy figure approaches Sam from behind, and he wheels around to face it, thinking it's Jack, only for a voice to say that Jack is gone and that I am the scariest son of a bitch in hell. I'm like, okay. So the being that inspired us to create Satan is just a complete ham and a kind of an asshole. Yeah, not fond of that dialogue. And the women, the figure envelops Sam, and the women come looking for him in the obelisk chamber, only finding a black laptop screen that soon forms the words, "Ladies, you're next." So once again, hammy and silly. They go looking for Mike next, but can't find him, and Mari suggests that Robin go look for Murphy while she checks the rest of the cave, so going full Scooby-Doo here and splitting up. And Mari tries to shut down the power unit itself, but it's locked off as well. She runs into Mike and apprises him of the situation, and that she thinks Jax has started up the experiment again. Mike says he knows, and she notices that his eyes have gone dark, so showing that he has been possessed. As they walk down the tunnel, Mari attacks the possessed Mike, beating him with the flashlight until he falls down and runs off. And we then go to Jack as he enters the codes to set off the facility's emergency override, which I guess would just open up the unit. And Murphy, whose radio has been locked off as well, because apparently that's tied into the computer coding as well for some reason. He finds Robin outside the cave crying, and she also has a darkness to her eyes that he doesn't notice quite. And she's trying to kill herself to get free of the possession, but the thing controlling her won't let her do it, and wants Murphy to do it for her. And he's not going along with it, and she eventually grabs a gun from him and shoots herself twice in the stomach, but the thing inside her takes over and kisses Murphy, passing the possession over to him. So that whole romantic build-up, I guess you could call it, just leads to this, which isn't really much of anything. And then the now free Robin decides she has to stop it from spreading and shoots Murphy in the head, and the two die in each other's arms. So, in the space of 10 pages, maybe less, the entire cast of characters gets possessed or killed. it's a little much. Like, it happens a little fast. Like, they could have spread this out a little bit longer, built a little bit more tension, spread out the exposition a little bit more, made it a little more natural at the beginning, and just explained a couple more things, built the tension with the characters disappearing instead of just, having it happen just in the blink of an eye the way it happens here. And Mari finds them lying there dead and gets cornered by the possessed Sam, along with the 6 members of Murphy's Spec Ops team who are also possessed, so yeah, they were totally useful. Sam does the usual possessed person thing of saying God can't help you, etc. But Mari, she actually reads off Psalm 23, it doesn't work, but she can smack him in the face with a crucifix, and that works. And she runs into the cave, and the 6 possessed Spec Ops team members don't do shit to stop her, so what was the point of them? And she finds Jack in the obelisk chamber, sitting and staring at the now open containment device. The monitor shows the gate open and multiple demons scrambling to get through it. Jack, who is now fully possessed, says her efforts are useless and he's planning to get out of there in the evac helicopter. He also refers to the demons as the losing side of a war long ago before he leaves. So they're not classical hell demons, but they're very similar in terms of backstory. We've just interpreted it in our own way, which once again, very interesting idea. Mari tries everything to stop the gate and the demons, but it's all locked off. And she then checks Jack's laptop, finding it still has an internet connection. Jack and the other possessed people soon return to the obelisk chamber, saying that the helicopters were called off, and asking Mari what she's done. She just says, "We're done here." And the screen says, "Text message sent." Mari then tells Jack, "Damn you to hell," as the cave is enveloped in white light as the nuke is dropped, and it ends. And that is a badass ending. Usually the solution to a problem like this isn't nuke it, but I think that's a really cool way to end the story, just to have her call in the nuke and sacrifice herself. That was a really good ending. So the script on the whole, the first 20 pages, that opening scene that's just there is an opening hook for someone to read, it feels isn't amazing. It's kind of bad. The following 15 pages of exposition need a lot of work. But there's also good character development between Mari and Robin. Good ideas, really interesting kind of Prince of Darkness-y ideas in here that are really fascinating. And if they were expanded on a little more and the script were a bit longer, it could maybe have been actually really good, but the way it is, it's just also compressed. It's hard to really keep up with it a lot of the time. And when the horror really should be ramping up, it all just happens so quickly that it ends. The tension building, the scene where the thing is coming through the gate and then they manage to stop it. That's really, really tense. But when people start getting possessed or dying, it happens so quickly, it's hard to get invested. And it just needed more work. This is a really interesting idea. And now it also, I'd argue it shouldn't be a From Beyond movie. It should just be its own thing, because aside from the idea of machines and things from another dimension, this really has very little to do with the idea of From Beyond. In fact, you could have maybe mentioned the events of the original story and maybe tie it into this somehow and make it a continuation of that idea. But that doesn't happen. That doesn't get mentioned. Instead, it's maybe Jack found that scientist's journal or something, but none of that happens. So it weirdly just feels like an original story that they've tacked the title onto for marquee value. It's really not something I particularly get or understand, but I will say this, there's a lot of potential here. If it was just worked on a little bit more care was put into it, maybe something could have come from this. But I mean, it's probably meant to be made on a smaller budget, and even as it is, I'm guessing the reason this didn't happen was they couldn't get funding for it, because this is a little bit more ambitious than this type of low-budget horror film usually is. But at the same time, it's ambitious, and I do appreciate it for that, but I don't really feel like it channels the ambition into any particularly interesting direction. It's a very frustrating script in that sense, because it just doesn't quite land. And so I can't believe it. This is going to end up being the shortest episode I've ever done. But yeah, that's really all I have left to say about From Beyond. It's a script I didn't hate reading, surprisingly. It's interesting. It's got its ideas. It has a lot of potential that just doesn't quite manage to meet. So From Beyond, it's a swing and a miss, but it's at least an interesting swing and a miss. Now, hopefully you enjoyed this, and be on the lookout for the 4-episode long thing that's going to be coming out soonish in February. Hopefully, it might spill over into March, but I hope you look forward to that, because it's going to be a whole lot of fun, at least for me. Hopefully it is for you. And until next time, guys, bye.